Stanford University.
Welcome to the final class of election 2012. Our subject matter tonight is going to be California politics. All right, so I'm going to turn the floor over to Jim for some introductions, and then we'll get class started.
The two people to introduce tonight, let me start with Gavin, who's on my left, your right. The first, and there are many things you could say about Gavin. One, he has better hair than I do, so Steve Schmidt made fun of my hair last week. I will say, but the biggest thing I would tell you about Gavin, who went to Santa Clara, and as you guys know, was maybe the youngest mayor in the history of San Francisco. 4 years ago, spoke in Rob's and my class and told the story of gay marriage and introducing gay marriage in San Francisco in 2004, something we will talk about now. So, you know, bold leadership way before the curve of where we are now. Look at what just happened in the elections. So Gavin has been an unbelievable leader in that way. But the truth is, I've seen him in two other contexts that I think, as you hear his remarks tonight, are worth thinking about. One is, I've also known him for a long time and seen him get married and have 2 kids and be an incredibly doting father, which completely changed his life in a great way. So I'd say that to the young people in the audience. And the second is, we've had him in class, how important that is and how that improves your career. Yeah, but he married up. He married up to a great woman who's a Stanford grad. But the other thing, true. Yeah. But the other thing I would tell you is, listen to Gavin tonight. This is the 3rd or 4th time he's taught our class with me and Rob, and he's a great teacher. And that's another thing I would say to, same thing about our other guest, Bruce Cain. So Bruce is now a professor at Stanford, but as David will remind you, he is the director designate of the Bill Lane Center for the West. And so he is going to be a very, very important person here at Stanford for years to come with David Kennedy in exploring the West. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He has his PhD from Harvard. He was a famous political scholar and public speaker at UC Berkeley. He's at NYU now. He's one of the great political speakers in the West Coast, and David lured him to Stanford to run the Lane Center, which is Stanford's gain for many years to come. So that's who we're going to have, Gavin and Bruce Cain as guests, but most of all, we're going to get David Kennedy to put the whole class in a historical perspective. So thank you all very much.
Well, I'd like to add my thanks to my colleagues for the technical staff, for Sam and Katie. And I want to repeat what others have said from my own perspective, what a privilege it's been to teach with Jim and Rob in this course. And we only have 2 of the many guests that we've had over the course of the last 7 or 8 weeks with us tonight. I want to thank Bruce and Gavin especially for being here, and through them, all the other guests that we've had. My task here in the next few minutes, and I'm going to try to do this briefly, not least by trying to see if I can stuff in as many words per minute as Jim Steyer does. I'm going to try to bring this back to California and the West by just talking a little bit about some history of our region, especially since World War II, and why it is that tonight's subject matter is so important. What you see up here on the screen is a very simple schematic map that actually contains an enormously important bit, or mass, I should say, of American history. The United States is the only country, to my knowledge, that mandates a decennial census in its constitution. Many countries take censuses of themselves, but we have written it into our constitution that we need to recount ourselves every 10 years. Why? Because the founders knew that the population would grow and it would move geographically, and they wanted to preserve the sacred principle of proportional representation in the People's Chamber, the House of Representatives, and not so incidentally, in the Electoral College. A side benefit of the fact that we have had a constitutionally mandated census every 10 years since 1790 is that we have tremendously fine-grained data about ourselves as a people over more than 2 centuries of time. And one of the things that the Census Bureau people and the demographers do with these data is that every 10 years they calculate something called the population center of gravity. And the methodology is fairly simple. If you think of a map of the United States as a weightless plane, and then we put weights on it according to where people live, where that map would balance on a needle point is the population center of gravity. Not to be confused with the frontier line, something related but different. So those little green triangles you see up there are the calculated population centers of gravity in all the censuses but one, 2010, going back to 1790. And as you can see, the period here, if this pointer is working, which apparently isn't very effectively. But you see between 1790 and 1880 as those green triangles march across the eastern third or so of the continent. That is the period of the great westward movement that we all studied in elementary and high school, if not elsewhere. And you can see, again, the intervals between those green triangles tell us the rapidity and the scale of that westward movement for roughly the first century of American nationhood. Then between 1880 and 1940, that population center of gravity barely moves. It doesn't even manage to get out of the state of Indiana, which is a kind of skinny state as these things go, whereas it had moved dramatically in the preceding century or so. And then beginning after World War II, 1940 onward, the westward movement resumes with a vengeance, and it also dips southward. Now, there are two things to be explained in this historically. What stopped or so dramatically slowed that westward movement in between 1880 and 1940? The simplest answer to that question is that the westward movement hit the fabled 100th meridian, which defines the eastern edge of the arid region of the United States. That's us. The west is the most arid part of the continent. And the western part of the continent simply could not absorb population on the scale that had happened in the first century of nationhood until something happened. And the something that happened beginning in the 1930s and especially in the 1960s was enormous federal government investment in infrastructure in our region, especially big dams for irrigation and hydroelectric generation. When those projects like Hoover Dam, Shasta Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville, Hungry Horse, Chief Joseph, Fort Peck, blah, 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 those great things that harness the energy in the rivers of the West begin to come online in the 30s, then the West is capable of being populated at the level that we've all seen in the last 2 or 3 generations. So this map, actually schematic and simple as it is, tells some enormously important chapters in American history. As of this date of this map, the population center of gravity there at 2000 was in the state of Missouri. It's still in the state of Missouri after the 2010 census outside a little hamlet called Plato. The only claim to fame that Plato, Missouri has is that it's the center of population gravity. But if that trend from 1940 to 2000, now 2010, if we can extrapolate that out for a few more decades, that's a big if, but if we could, and if we do, that population center of gravity in approximately 2050 or 60 is likely to be in Texas. And by that time, we will be a majority Western country. More Americans will live west of the 100th meridian than east of it, and that is a seismic change in our demographic character, our lifestyles, and not least of all, we'll come back to this, our political center of gravity. This is just another way of capturing essentially the same idea, with emphasis especially on the post-World War II period. The blue states in this map are the states whose population has grown at less than the national average since essentially World War II. The yellowish states are the ones where population has grown at greater than the national average rate of growth. And again, you'll see population growth has been heavily concentrated in the southeast and the greater west. The West has become the destination for immigration in a way that the Northeast was 100 years ago. Those great waves of European immigration came into New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and the Ohio River Valley, essentially. Today, in our time, is predominantly Hispanic immigration into the West, especially the Southwest. And of course, Asian immigration is also an increasingly dominant or large factor in the life of our region. And again, you can see that the West dominates as the destination for Asian immigration as well. Another way to, again, capture the same idea, the basic point I'm trying to make here is that since World War II, our region has assumed ever increasing importance in the national scales. 1900, if you look at this list of the 10 largest cities, there's only one Western city, it's San Francisco. 1930, there's still only one Western city of the 10 largest cities in the United States. It's Los Angeles, in the middle of the pack. Get to 2007, this would not change if we had 2010 data up here. 7 of the 10 largest cities in the United States are in the West. So it's just another harbinger of the future and a register of what has happened here since World War II, essentially, in the last few generations. These demographic facts are tracked by economic facts of the 4 traditional regions of the United States: Northeast, South, Midwest, and West. The West accounts for just about 1/3 of GDP. And if we think, as many people do, that the most dynamic part of the global economy is in Asia, then the West's share of this country's economic commerce with Asia is just disproportionately huge. Fully more than half of American exports to Asia originate in the 17 Western states. These economic and demographic facts obviously have political implications, and now we bring this back to our subject matter. This is the reapportionment as of the 2010 census. Unfortunately, the map doesn't show the gains in each state. It just shows the results after the reapportionment. But again, you'll see that all the gainers are in, again, the Southeast and the West. The losers are in the Midwest and the Northeast. It's worth noting here, just in passing, since California is our subject here in particular tonight, you'll see California, although it has the largest number of congressional seats, by quite a margin over the second biggest state, which is Texas. Incidentally, 1/3 of all Americans today live in the West. 1 out of every 5 Americans lives in either Texas or California, and 1 out of 8 live in California. California congressional delegation is by far the biggest, but as this map tells us, if you drill down on it, for the second time, only the second time since 1850, when California became a state, California did not gain a congressional seat in this reapportionment. Texas, on the other hand, gained 4. So even though the West as a whole remains the most dynamic part of the country, even within the West, there are other changes going on, and we should worry about that here in California, that we may be losing the role of economic and demographic leader to another Western state, namely Texas. Again, this shows essentially the same thing, just a slightly different scheme. And this brings us to the Electoral College implications of this. This map is actually out of date, even though it was projecting 2030. The 17 Western states, as of the 2010 reapportionment, control 183 Electoral College votes. If you add in the other 2 Western states, what else are we going to call them, Alaska and Hawaii, the 19 then Western states control 190 Electoral College votes. It takes 270 to elect a president. So again, by some date in the not terribly distant future, if the Western states, act as a bloc, they'd only need to recruit 2 or 3 or 4 other fairly large states, and they could dominate the national political system in perpetuity. Bringing this back to California, I'll use this image just by way of transitioning back to our own home state here. I love this photograph because it's an image that sums up a lot of what I've been saying about the increasing importance of the West and especially its increasing political weight. This is a photograph of Ronald Reagan's first inauguration, 1981. You see him down there at the bottom of the frame giving his inaugural address. What's remarkable to me and powerfully symbolic to me about this photograph is the direction that Ronald Reagan is facing. He's facing down the mall to the Washington Monument, out to the Potomac. He's facing west. Why is this remarkable? From an historian's point of view, it's extremely symbolically remarkable because Ronald Reagan was the first president ever since all the inaugurals started happening in Washington, D.C. with Thomas Jefferson in 1801. From Thomas Jefferson in 1801 through Jimmy Carter in 1977, every single president in that long run was inaugurated on the eastern facade of the Capitol. Ronald Reagan, when the time came to prepare his inauguration, said, "Nothing doing. I'm a man of the West. The West is the future. I want to be facing west when I take that oath of office." And that's why he stood there and took the oath of office. And every president since has been inaugurated on the western facade of the Capitol. So it's just a powerfully symbolic statement of the national political culture's recognition of the growing importance of our region. Okay, now we brought it back to California. All I've been trying to do up to this point is convince you that our subject matter tonight is pretty important in our region and in particular in our state. And we're blessed tonight to have 2 deeply knowledgeable and engaged people to talk about this in Bruce Cain and Gavin Newsom. But let me just bring it back to California because our own state has many peculiar political characteristics. But one of them has to do with the way it's voted in presidential elections in the last couple of generations. Before roughly the midpoint of this century, California was, as they say today, somewhat in play politically, although it trended heavily Republican. It voted Republican in the 1960 election, gave Richard Nixon a majority, not John F. Kennedy, so it was out of step with the rest of the country on that occasion. Voted Democratic in 1964, not for Barry Goldwater, but for Lyndon Johnson. But then for the next 6 presidential elections, the 68 through 88 cycle of presidential elections, California voted consistently Republican. Beginning in 1992, ever since in presidential elections, California has voted consistently Democratic and is now thought to be a safely blue state from the people who take comfort in that fact. Arnold Schwarzenegger is the only Republican to win either the governorship or a state senator, U.S. senator's position or the presidency since 1994. This has been a heavily Democratic state. The reasons for this are many, and our 2 people tonight are going to know more about this than I do, but I just want to put in the hopper one possible explanation for this was the passage in 1994 of something called Prop 187, which was a popular initiative passed by a huge margin that was aimed essentially at restricting the liberties and rights of immigrants. It's widely thought that the Republican parties and the then Republican governors Pete Wilson's support for Prop 187 was the stroke that killed off the Republican Party as an effective political force in this state, and especially with increasing majorities of Latino voters in this state ever since, that has been true in spades. As of 2010 census, California has roughly 37 million people in it. About 39 and a fraction percent are white. About 38 and a fraction percent are Latino. About 13% Asian. About 6 or 7% black. California is one of 4 so-called majority-minority states where no ethnic group has a majority. Interestingly, given what I've just been talking about, all 4 majority-minority states are Western states. It's Texas, New Mexico, California, and Hawaii, which has been in that category for a long, long time. So that changing demographic of our state and our region has had powerful political consequences, not least of all the virtual extinction of the Republican Party in this state as an effective political force. So that's just a little background to frame this evening's discussion, and now we'll get to it. Thank you.
Let's start a conversation with our guests here. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't take advantage of the Lieutenant Governor's presence here to acknowledge that something he did 8 years ago, days into his mayorship of San Francisco, namely to perform marriage ceremonies for gays and lesbians in San Francisco. A mere 8 years later, has come to pass that the first time ever in American history within a state has there been a popular vote that has given legal sanction to the issue of gay marriage. So, Lieutenant Governor, you played a significant role in that back when it was very, very unpopular. Perhaps not unpopular in San Francisco, but nationally extremely unpopular.
Yeah.
Can you reflect upon the past 8 years?
Yeah, never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. I really didn't. I mean, remember in 2004, the big debate was civil unions, and Democrats hadn't even brought themselves to any consensus around civil unions. In fact, you may recall, and it's worth taking a look to verify, because I had heard stories. Until I read it, I was reinforced, mesmerized by this. But Bill Clinton had told Howard Dean at the time when he advanced civil unions in Vermont, said, "You've given up any opportunity to ever become President of the United States, Governor Dean, because of your support for civil unions." Think how far we've come now with these 3 states and then the rejection in another state. But see, at the same time, consider how far we were pushed back since 2004 as well, with all these constitutional amendments, et cetera, which will only be ultimately unwound by the courts. It's always important to be reminded, Loving versus State of Virginia case in 1967, when blacks couldn't marry whites in 16 states. They were denied on the basis of their race the ability to say "I do." And it wasn't until the Supreme Court, an activist court, before the term activist court was even conceived in 67, unanimously overturned those laws. It's interesting as well to note that if that were submitted to popular vote, you look at the Gallup polling in 1967, if we had just submitted it to the whims or wills of the majority, we would still, I believe, in many states not have interracial marriage because 70% of Americans opposed interracial marriage in 1967 when the court stepped in and stepped up. It's a long-winded way of saying we're looking forward to this time next year, we believe, that the U.S. Supreme Court will take up DOMA and take up the Prop 8 case with David Boies and Ted Olson at the Supreme Court. So it's a remarkable time in history.
Let me ask you, Bruce and Gavin, to just play on that for a second, because this is, this is California. We had a talk last week with my brother Tom and Steve Schmidt and Simon Jackman from the Poli-Sci department here about, is California the bellwether? And do you guys still think that's true? That's a common cliche, if you will. But Bruce, you've studied California as much as anybody. I'd be interested in what you guys both think about. Are we really the bellwether? And if we are, what does that mean? What are we seeing now that's going to affect the rest of the country, like gay marriage did 8 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways we are, in some ways we're not. But I think on this issue we were, certainly. And I think to go back to sort of David's analysis, there's both a political story to that and there's a demographic story. I mean, just as Gavin had to face skepticism from people within the party, and I must say I was one of the people that thought that this was going to hurt the Democratic Party, even though it was the right thing to do. That was the same thought that Lyndon Johnson had when they were passing the civil rights legislation in 1964. He said, and I think Jess Unruh said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they both predicted that it would hurt the Democratic Party. And that interval that David was talking about from 1968 to 1988 was basically the effects, the after effects of that decision, a courageous decision on the part of the Democratic Party, but nonetheless one that hurt them. And it was only because the Reagan Democrats, the working class and Southern Democrats, realigned themselves, and the working class whites in states like California basically went from over 40% of the electorate down to 20% of the electorate, and the number of educated, college-educated whites and college-educated women and working women increased, and most importantly now, generational replacement, i.e. the young voters, many of whom are out here in the audience. This is the demographic story that underlies the political story. I think there's political factors too, like what Gavin did, the fact that we've had some court decisions that give legitimacy to the idea that equal rights should be extended along sexual lines. So I think with any kind of political story, there's a long-term aspect of it, a kind of compositional change aspect of it, and then there are these important events that also cause changes and realignments in political situations.
Bruce, as you probably know, the story is that when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and as these guys do, they handed various pens to people that backed them and all this, and so the story goes, he handed one of the pens to his aide, Bill Moyers, and said, Bill, I think by signing this act, I've just lost the South for the Democratic Party for at least a generation, which turned out to be absolutely right.
Exactly true.
It begs the question, was it the right thing to do? Ultimately, I mean, I think the question for me, and I'm coming to grips with, is I believe that this is a country that values power over courage. And I think that's a rather distressing thing. And, it begs the question of the success of the Democratic Party here in the state of California. We have supermajorities. And you would think, well, wait a second, there's 1.87 million people that are unemployed. If you're from Imperial County, they're 28.5% unemployment today. 28.5. That's not underemployment. We've got people living in two different worlds in the same state. Look at the poverty numbers. We can just go through a list of everything that's wrong. And it's a pretty ominous list. And you say, well, we all got rewarded for what one could argue is pretty bad behavior. There wasn't a lot of courage on 3 strikes. How many statewide elected officials came out to support 3 strikes reform? How many came out to support repeal the death penalty? How many have come out to say publicly what 98% of the folks I talk to on both sides of the aisle say on decriminalizing marijuana? And so to actually say at times, I mean, Bruce is right. I had to deal with a father, who was a progressive judge, but said, can't you just call it something else? I had to wake up to my very close friend, Senator Feinstein, who all but suggested that the election was handed over to George Bush because of the actions in San Francisco. A lot of critique, and a lot of folks were more cautious and have found the right time to embrace the issue and are doing extraordinarily well and still don't have to deal with the consequences and the scars of those old battles. So it's something I'm just reflecting on. And I don't know if it concerns you as much as it concerns me, but I am concerned about it because I think of Sacramento, it works remarkably well in private, but we're not doing a particularly good job in public. And it's because there's a lack of courage to stand on principle in both parties. Because the consequences of courage. Final point. I became lieutenant governor not because I beat the incumbent lieutenant governor. He beat himself a year before he put his name on the ballot. He had the courage of supporting a temporary tax measure, a Republican, with Governor Schwarzenegger. And he and his 3 colleagues shared that in common and shared one other thing in common. All of them were thrown out. He was not supported by his own party because he had broke that no tax pledge. We don't value courage. We value power.
Yeah, could I say something about that? I
Sure.
mean, I think there's the issue of whether an individual politician has courage, but you can't design a system around people having above average courage. There just aren't enough people like that. So you have to design a system, you have to look at the system and say, why is it that politicians in general don't have that level of courage? And it's not, what you're talking about is the possibility of losing office. Yeah. And so what you're talking about is a hypersensitivity to the electoral incentive that we built into the system. And it's partly our own fault. That is to say that what happens is we believe that more democracy is always the solution to whatever problem we have. So we multiply the number of offices we have, we increase the number of polls we have, we have recall elections, we have referendum and initiatives, and these are all attempts by the voters to somehow get greater control over the political system. But as we do that, we create enormous short-term incentives for politicians, which makes it very hard not only to do courageous things on social issues, but let's talk about infrastructure. Let's talk about the fact that infrastructure, not only in our state, but in a state like New York, was ignored. They knew for 10 or 15 years that they were going to be vulnerable to a hurricane, that it was going to take billions of dollars to do something about that. Governor Schwarzenegger pointed out that our Delta system is extremely vulnerable to earthquakes. We have lots of infrastructure problems, but you don't get rewarded for thinking around the long term, and especially now in the era of term limits, when you're thinking just of the next election and the next office, there's no incentive to engage in bills that are going to take 8 years or 9 years to hatch. You just can't do that anymore.
You know, it's interesting. Dov Simon wrote a great book called How, and he talks about situational values, short-term thinking versus sustainable values in the broadest sense of the word. And I think that defines our politics. It's situational. It's whatever the situation calls for. Some would argue that Prop 30 was an answer to the situational context of solvency. Was it a solution, a sustainable solution? Did it reform our tax code? Did it address the underlying issues that brought us to these boom-bust cycles in the first place? Well, no. But it's what the situation called for. And that's been the case for decades, I think, in American politics and certainly in California politics. And I think that's very ominous. But it goes to your point. What then can we do? As the old books say, if you want to move the mouse, you got to move the cheese. How do we change those incentives for good behavior as it relates to those more sustainable frame of thinking versus that short-term thinking?
I'd like to ask a question of both of you serially. And for one of any better system, why don't we go in alphabetical order, Cain before Newsom in response. But my assumption is, maybe you can challenge it, maybe it's not accurate, but I think it is, that you would agree, both of you, that our state governmental system is pretty dysfunctional. So if that's an operational premise, then I'd like you each to say, what is the single most dysfunctional element in the picture?
Oh boy, there's so much to choose from. It's like going to a good restaurant and picking from the menu. I think, it probably is the problem I was just talking about, but I think that the interest group reaction to what I was talking about, in other words, the first part of it is the importance of getting elected. And then what we're getting now is extremely powerful interest groups partly now incentivized by the new campaign finance rules that are coming in. And what they do is they push you on specific issues. And a lot of the inertia we have in the political system is based, if it's not on something that voters really care about, and many issues are issues that voters don't care about, but the interest groups do. And the problem that you have is typified by a student of mine who 10 or 15 years ago wanted to run for a city council seat in the Castro Valley. They were setting up their first city council. And so, we gave her instructions on what she should do, and she needed to raise money, and she didn't have to raise a lot of money by Gavin standards, but, for running for a local seat, you had to have $35,000, $40,000. And she didn't have the personal wealth for that, but she had to find it somewhere. So she went around to the unions, and of course what the unions told her was, yeah, we'll give you this money, but we expect you to take this position. Okay? Now that's not corruption in the sense that anybody's making a dime out of this. What it is it's interest group politics, people saying, well, if I'm going to give you this resource, I expect you to stand up for me. And what we've done is fractionalized the political system, and these interest groups now are extremely powerful, extremely important, because it's so expensive to run for office. So if I were to say there was one other problem other the one I started with, I would say it would be that one.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce, I could not agree with you more. It's money, period. I mean, that's the end of the day. It comes out, especially in a state as large as ours. You can't out-hustle. This is not Rhode Island or Maine or Vermont. You can't beat these special interests, not when you need $2.2 million a week to saturate the Southern California market. I mean, how else do you compete? And it's not just the actual money, it's the threat of money being used against you, or the incentive of money being used for you. And that's the great challenge. I mean, that was Tom's great success. Your brother had the ability and means to do much more. He didn't have to, but he had the ability and means. Had he not, the Prop 39 would not have passed.
Correct.
And we probably would be talking about what happened to AB 32 in the cap and trade bill, because Prop 23 probably would have passed, because those oil companies, Valero and Tesoro, could have put in $100+ million easily and defeated that effort. So I think at the end of the day, it's money. The question is, though, what do you do about it? Do you want to do public financing? You keep saying yes, but no. JFK was talking about public financing. We have a version, when I was mayor of San Francisco, it even frustrated me as someone who's supportive. And then I was running against 25 people for my reelection for mayor because of public financing. Everyone can run. And we had a debate with literally 25 of us. One guy was naked, so he couldn't show up, but he was getting hundreds of grand. So we had to put an apron on him. Another guy named Grasshopper had just gotten out of jail, was on parole. And we were funding them. And I was shutting down homeless shelters, literally changing the hours of operation of a homeless shelter. And I was doing the math of all the candidates and saying, is this public financing? So even I, as an advocate, I get the reticence, right, to support those guys, whoever those guys are. But something's got to give, because this is serious. This is code red from my perspective on both sides of the political aisle. It is very damaging. It reminds me of the old line. We've got the Lincoln film coming up. Abraham Lincoln once said, we're all born originals, but we die copies. And it kind of reminds me of candidates for office. There's an originality. There's a quality of imagination, a spirit. And then by the time they're termed out, you go, well, what happened to you? And it's a system that sort of eats you up, and the realities of the situation, and playing within the tribe, and being respectful to one another, and not embarrassing your colleagues, and making sure you're protecting that base and the base of support and the financial support that comes with it.
So I wanted to ask you guys one question I was going to ask is about leadership, and Bruce, looking back in California and where we are right now. One of the questions is, do you think that what Gavin is saying is correct, is that it's not that we have lacked leaders, it's that the system has overcome them, that it has been too powerful because of money or whatever. So that's one question. The second one that relates to it is, last week we looked at Prop 30, and the passage of Prop 30 as potentially, hey, this is a major step forward for the state, but we were talking before earlier, this is just doubling down on the status quo. So two questions. One, has the system basically made it impossible for leaders to emerge? And second, where are we right now in the most recent election a week ago? Are we just doubling down on the status quo in California?
Well, the term doubling down on the status quo refers to the fact that the fundamental problem with the tax situation in California is that it's pro-cyclical. In other words, in in the days when we could rely on property tax, we had a more stable base of taxation for local government. And when we passed Proposition 13, not 113, it seems like that, but Prop 13, basically we took away the most stable part of local government financing and at the same time made local government dependent on the state government, which is the last place you want to go, because the part of government that has the most confidence is local government, because people see the services, understand what the community is about. When you throw it up to the state level, so you basically make the state responsible for raising the money, and then you give the money to local governments to pay for it, you get two kinds of disconnects. You get the disconnect with the voters who say, wait a minute, we're sending the money to Sacramento? And then you get the disconnect between Sacramento and local government, because local government isn't very well controlled by the state, and then you get some of the pension scandals and other things that we have. So it's a double whammy. So doubling down on the status quo, yes. What the problem we have is, how do you run state services or government services in a stable way if you have a completely unstable revenue stream? I knew this at the University of California. In fact, I traded in all the state money for the UC-DC school that I had, because I could see that the money was going down, and moreover, I couldn't plan courses. I couldn't plan staff if I didn't know whether I was going to have a 30% cut next year. Okay, you just can't do that. And under the state governments, unlike the federal government, can't run a deficit technically. Now we do in various secret ways, or not secret ways, underhanded ways. We run sort of deficits, but they're not adequate to the kinds of problems we have. So the problem that you're talking about, doubling down, is that by putting more onto sales tax and income tax, you're doubling down on the volatility of the revenue stream, which really means that we need to do something that's much more fundamental in terms of tax reform. And how we get from here to there is the critical question, given that I don't think the answer is to look for some heroic leader. I think the answer is somehow to find an institution that brings the responsible parties to the table. The tax commission that Arnold Schwarzenegger did just sort of fell apart. I don't think it was very open. I don't think it took enough testimony. But maybe something like that is the way you start a dialogue about these structural problems. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm not a big believer anymore, and I'm hoping my position evolves in the guy or gal on the white horse to come in and save the day. And in many respects, it makes some sense, the world we're living in. And that's not a question, by the way, we ask ourselves. It's the one we should ask and answer every single day. I had Tom Freeman in a conference the other day, and he reminded all of us that's the one question that seems to be absent in the political debate. What world are we living in? And it's the question the private sector asks all the time. Otherwise, they're not able to compete. The point being that the world's increasingly flattened. I mean, not just in the context, as Freeman says, of the world being connected and globalized, but hierarchy is increasingly being challenged. The world's sort of turning on its head. It's more peer-to-peer. It's side by side. It's the armies of Davids, really. It's small is getting big. Big is getting small. Just think of what happened in the Arab Spring, but elsewhere, a lot of these movements. And I think that's a wonderful and extraordinary thing. And you're seeing that flattening, obviously, in media. We've seen it in the last few years. We were talking a little bit about what we think is about to happen with education, and I ultimately argue with government generally. But the issue, so that's the first point. The second point, the issue of the taxes is difficult because everyone has a trophy on the wall. You got the folks that brought us Prop 13, and so they don't want to touch it. They fought hard to get Prop 13. My gosh, they say, if we didn't have Prop 13, think about how horrific it would be to do business in California. We have the highest income taxes, the highest sales tax, the highest corporate tax, among the highest capital gains. Thank God, they say, we have relatively stable property taxes. So all these things, one has to sort of absolve the fact you've got these special interests are holding on to their piece of the pie. And why? Because they are living in a model of scarcity. And we've been in that model for years and years in California. People holding on to their piece of the pie, fearful. And they're going to do everything to hold on to that. And we've moved away from, I think, you know, David, you're talking about those old maps. I'm just thinking about the 50s and 60s and 70s when we were in the future business in California. It was a framework not of scarcity, but abundance. You know, Ronald Reagan talked to, or you know, maybe it was our great librarian, Ken Starr, said it, but I'll give it credit to Reagan, talked about that coast of dreams. this notion, Horace Greeley, right? Go west, young man, go west, which was your slides. People would go west to start something. California, if you wanted to join something, go back east. There was sort of this sense of pioneering spirit, this sense of optimism, again, the future business. And we've lost that. And that's the great struggle, is how we bring that back. It still exists in pockets, and we're living in one here. Extraordinary ways. But again, how do you juxtapose that with the Imperial County example I used, or San Bernardino, where 150,000 of the 300,000 homes in San Bernardino County today are underwater or near underwater on their mortgages. And so that's the great opportunity, not just challenge for the state.
So again, thinking then in a forward-looking way about the political situation, it was mentioned last week in our last class what was also just mentioned here, that the Democratic Party now has a supermajority in Sacramento. Republicans, in certain ways, don't even need to be consulted, as it was said last week. It was the view of Steve Schmidt, who mentioned this, that one-party rule is arrogant and complacent. And even if you were a partisan Democrat, you should not wish for a supermajority of the Democratic Party. So can you comment on that idea? And then more specifically, what do you predict over the next, say, 6 months, 9 months, as Democrats actually can pass legislation without even consulting Republicans?
What do you think, Bruce?
Thanks, Gavin. That was good. He knows what he's doing.
I might say, just while you're thinking about an answer, Bruce.
No.
Bruce and I met this morning with a state assembly person. And essentially, Bruce, I believe, asked her this question, and we didn't get much of an answer.
She didn't. So, all right, so model number one is what happened to Gray Davis. That the last time the Democrats Gray Davis was in power and the Democrats controlled, they didn't have a supermajority, but Gray Davis was not as likely to veto things as Jerry is, in my opinion. But at any rate, the party really, after the re-election, fell apart because it was divided between expectations of the base and the Gary Souths and many of the political consultants for Davis that really wanted him to stick to a moderate, centrist, business-oriented viewpoint. And he just wasn't able to do that, and that divisions ultimately led to his demise. And there were other things, too, the way he handled the electricity crisis. But I think underneath that was a real tension. So the great irony of this election, in theory, can be that it moves both parties to the right. That would be in other words, the Republican Party, because it shrinks, moves to the right, and the Democratic Party, because it takes over areas that used to be controlled by the Democrats, moves to the right. And that happened in the early 80s with Willie Brown. There was the Gang of Five. I helped create some of those seats, and I watched it for the whole decade. And by the end of the decade, about 88, they were trying to unseat Willie. Because they needed to stay in office, and this state as a whole tends to be a little bit to the center right on economic policies, and very much on the center left on social policies. So the question is, all right, so now the Democrats are back in this situation. They've got a whole bunch of people that are in these marginal seats. They're going to want to keep those seats. And so that means that all the things that Gavin and I were talking about before, the electoral incentives are going to kick in. And the question is, can you undertake Prop 13 reform and put something on the ballot with a 2/3 vote and expect, you're going to need every single one of those people, by the way. There's no margin for somebody ducking out. So what are the odds of that? I think Gavin and I would not bet our wallets on that one, okay? So, but I think what does come out of that, and maybe we have to think about this, is how Jerry was able to get this tax increase, which is using the initiative and referendum system as a way of getting consent for things, but somehow doing it in a more enlightened way than we've done in the past. But I think that's the only way. I think that the two moves that I think the Democrats need to think about are, one, making sure, I think the Republicans made a mistake not allowing the tax increase to go on the ballot, basically saying we know better than the voters to decide. I think the other move is to move as much as we can back down to local government so that we connect the ability to spend with the ability to raise money. So that means, loosening the rules down to get majoritarian accountability down at the local government level, trying to push more of the responsibility for local government functions down there, which the state can't really monitor very well anyway, and because they're the most unpopular part of the government, they're the ones that shouldn't be asking for the money. It should be down on the localities. I think that's probably a more politically feasible path than trying to redo Prop 13, except maybe the commercial part that you've talked about.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to me. There was one reform in Prop 30 that hasn't really gotten the attention it's about to or deserves to. And that was this notion of realignment, which is exactly what Bruce is talking about, sort of realigning the state funding down to the local level. This was done around the issue of criminal justice, the prison issues that were really thrust upon us and turned out to be a gift. The state was pushed aside, there was a judge, basically a judge order, so the special arbiter of the good or bad decisions that needed to be made that politicians couldn't make, forced our hand on reducing the size of our prison population and forced us to look at county functions a little bit differently. And now with Prop 30, we have a mechanism to fund them, at least for 4 and 7 years. Remember, the initiative, quote unquote, sunsets. That said, there's a big push by Democrats for some time. The realignment ideas, in many respects, didn't come from the governor. They came from the head of the Senate, Darrell Steinberg, who really believes in this. And I think there's going to be a big push, happened a little bit under Wilson, Republican, happening now in Democrat, a big push to continue to push those services and the accountability down to the municipal level. And I think that's a great thing. As an ex-mayor, I think that's the right thing to do. So I think that's a very positive thing. And I think that's an alignment of the political stars on the left and the right. Look, I'm not so worried about the 2/3. Of course, that's easy for me to say as a Democrat. If it was 2/3 Republicans, I'd be scared to death. Just because I know how dysfunctional we are. And I know how much we disagree in private, and I think the reality, as Bruce said, is some of these more moderate districts, the real control is going to be on some moderate senators and moderate assembly members that will really control the fate of the party on some of these supermajority decisions. I think the governor has positioned himself brilliantly from a political frame. He's not going to support any taxes unless they go to the voters. There'll probably be a lot of push to avoid having to spend millions of dollars to get things on the ballot by getting your signature and try to get 2/3 to place all kinds of things on the ballot, be it an oil severance tax or a vehicle license fee reversions. By the way, the VLF is the biggest contributor to our woes, and I think was a big contributor to Gray Davis's recall, and one of the grand mistakes historically that any governor's made, and that was Schwarzenegger following through, to his credit, on a campaign promise, putting pen to paper and reducing that vehicle license fee, which has cost the state close to 40 plus. I heard someone suggest it was over $44 billion, something that for decades no one talked about, became a political football, and has been, from my perspective, even more damaging in some ways than Prop 13. I think there'll be a push to at least consider placing some of those things on the ballot for you to decide which direction you want to go. But I think the issue of water is going to be a dominant focus and an appropriate one. Issues of infrastructure, $765 billion of deferred infrastructure beyond just the issues of high-speed rail. We've got to start focusing on our bridges and our roads and our ports. I just came back from Incheon Airport. I haven't even been to South Korea. Literally one of the most magnificent airports I've ever experienced. It's a place where you want your flight to be canceled or delayed. 2 golf courses. I mean, it's just has a hotel and
That's
museums.
what happens when you're lieutenant governor.
Yeah,
You can sit
you
there.
You can travel. You can, yeah, exactly. But I flew back to LAX. Exactly. And it's not an indictment, but I mean, it really was. Someone said this in another context. I'm just going to steal it. It literally was like flying from the Jetsons to the Flintstones in terms of infrastructure. And it just underscores the work we have to do there. And so I think those are the things that this Democratic supermajority can do that are meaningful and substantive.
David, can I just ask one question? I want to follow up on the Prop 13 thing, particularly, I mean, to you, Gavin, but to you, Bruce. Look, if on its face, if you and you can say what you want to say, obviously, Gavin. Why isn't at least some courageous politician, remember the lack of, out there going, let's really examine Prop 13, not just the split roll. The split roll is the part about taking away the corporate Prop 13 example. But why isn't someone putting that out the way you put out gay marriage in 2004, so that 6 years from now, California will face the facts of what Prop 13 really did to the infrastructure of the state, to the local control, to all the other things that you guys mentioned? Why doesn't somebody just take that and go there? Maybe they
did.
lose.
Warren Buffett.
Huh?
We should take
Yeah.
1 minute for any undergraduate in the room who's not from California to explain what Prop 13 is and what it's done.
Bruce, California or
Yeah,
California?
no, but put it in a historic
Yeah.
context.
Well,
yeah.
basically, back in the 70s, we experienced a huge surge in housing prices. And what was happening was the assessments were going up very rapidly. And there were stories of people living on fixed income and others who were faced with the prospect of not being able to live in those homes any longer. And so what Prop 13 did was cap basically the total, both the rate at which the assessments could go up unless you sold the house and the total amount of property tax that you would spend. And it also put supermajority rules into voting for any tax increase of property taxes. And what it did was create a system of enormous inequity because anybody that owned a home before 1978 was grandfathered in. And I had a project back when I was at Berkeley working with the Chronicle. We were looking for the moment at which the number of people that owned property that they had bought before 78 would be exceeded by the number of people who bought after, and we were predicting that there would be a change in attitudes. And of course there was none. And the reason was, we did some survey analysis of this, is that basically you were always better off on this system than the person who buys 2 years after you or 3 years after you. So you always had this fear that when it was all reshuffled, you would be worse off than where you are right now. But of course you had for a long time these enormous inequities between people on the same block and the value of the homes and the assessments that they were at. And that's never been fixed. It's not quite as stark now, but it also means that counties where there's a lot of turnover can get much more revenue than some of the smaller rural counties that don't get the same turnover. So, and then there's the commercial side, which I'll let you explain.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and Jim, the fact is there are a lot of elected officials that have the courage of their convictions on Prop 13. The challenge is convincing all of you of the merits of it and getting the support to actually get something on the ballot. The polling on it is dismal. It's just as bad as the vehicle license fee because once you got that lower rate, everyone's going to hold on to it. The challenge for me is we have not in the last decade or so had a consistent discussion, a public discussion about reform. We have these sort of sporadic, we have groups, California Forward doing great work. Nicholas Bergeron comes in, a billionaire, wants to change the world, and well-intended, he comes in with a think tank and comes up with his recommendations. You have other independent groups that do the same thing, and they flare up, they get a lot of attention, people get excited, and they even place in front of you Prop 31. And what do? You say, what's 2-year budgets? I'm not into that. I'm not into a rainy day reserve, pay as you go. I'm not into this realignment stuff as we've discussed because I don't really understand that. That's a little complicated. And the elected officials don't want to touch it because it changes their power structure as well. And the interest groups, it changes theirs. So then it's a setback. And then we have another think tank, a think tank of think tanks. But we've not had a consistent narrative. And for me, to change Prop 13, it can't be done in isolation. If you want to bring manufacturing back to California, we want to get back into the business of people and products, then we've got to make a case for California, and especially when they're lowering income taxes on the high end in Oregon, Washington State's more competitive. There's a reason Intel's going up. They have no corporate tax. Nevada, Texas. And we're now at 13.3%. We have the highest sales tax, as I said, 8.84% corporate taxes. We're not necessarily as competitive as some of the others. But so let's have that discussion about how we can move towards a sales tax that's lower, but starts to tax that $1 trillion of the economy that we don't tax, which are services. And then we can have a conversation about shifting things over X period of time on the issues of industrial and commercial and residential taxes. But we have to have that, I think, overall conversation. We tend to have them in isolation. And that gives us, I think, the false sense of real reform when there's unintended consequences always on the other side. That would be my argument. But that has to come from the top. That's where I think leadership does matter. A consistent dialogue with the public, real participation, a real framework of engagement. That's why I supported, and boy, I was wrong on this. This got nowhere, this idea of a constitutional convention in California. We have one of the longest constitutions in the world. It's been amended hundreds and hundreds of times. I mean, it's laughable. And yet, no one wants to necessarily begin to have a comprehensive conversation because, again, people are holding on to their trophies. They say, well, let's have it but not include Prop 98 in the set-aside for K through 14 education. Let's have it but not include Prop 13. We'll have it if we don't include, if we only include Prop 8. Whatever the issue is, and then it just starts to fall apart.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. If you look at, and David can back me up on this, if you look at the frequency of constitutional conventions, they were quite frequent in the 19th century. They start to tail off a bit in the early 20th century. And then since the 1960s, they basically have died. And even states that have mandatory consideration of constitutional convention find that there's no appetite out there. And the most you can do is amendment. So everybody's doing amendments. And amendments are nice, but again, it gets to Gavin's point that amendments are partial. They're about a specific piece of the problem. They don't take a comprehensive, coherent look. So what we're seeing in California is actually a part of the context nationally of what's going on with conventions, or constitutional conventions. And the reason is, again, goes back to where we were 40 minutes ago, which is that you don't even have to look at the demise of this last attempt at, you can look at the demise of the Constitutional Revision Commission in the 90s. Basically what happens is that every constituency, as Gavin says, that holds on to its own, looks at the big picture and says, I don't like this piece, and so I'm opposed to it. And so what you have is a coalition of interests, each of them looking at their specific piece of the puzzle, not willing to make any trade-offs. And so it becomes impossible to make kind of comprehensive deals. This is why it's going to be so hard with a fiscal cliff. It's true of conventions, it's true of large comprehensive solutions generally, that making these trade-offs becomes very hard because each one of the groups that has a particular objection objects so strongly and so well. So I think I completely agree with Gavin, we need to do it. I think the last version of it scared the death of me because I'm sorry, I just was on a radio show 2 days ago where somebody was asking me about government by lottery. Why don't we replace all the elected officials with citizens chosen by lottery and they'll serve for a year? And would this make, and actually there is apparently serious academics that
how
are
Athens
behind that.
operated.
Yeah, exactly. And I said, I honestly think that's a wacky and irresponsible idea. And, but that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to choose citizens, some number of citizens, 500 citizens. They wanted to pay them $50,000 or $60,000 to take the year off and think about constitutional problems. And think how far we've gone from, the Constitutional Convention and the people that were there. And so what's happened is that there's now a suspicion, the suspicion of expertise in America has become so severe that we don't believe that politicians should have any expertise or knowledge, and we don't believe the people who put together the rules should have any expertise or knowledge. It's really just all about biases and values, and so what we need is just a proliferation of citizen juries to decide everything. And I'm sorry, I don't buy that. I mean, I wouldn't be a political scientist if I believed that you were as good a citizen if you know nothing as opposed to whether you know something. I'm sorry. I have 30, 40 years of prejudice against that. And it's very hard for me to overcome that. And I was on these phone calls. I decided that I would listen in because I didn't quite believe they were really thinking this. And sure enough, they were thinking it. And the other problem then you have is that there were lots of people that had their little hobby horse. And so you had people that wanted to do proportional representation. And you say, okay, how does that solve our governance problems to have proportional representation? But it didn't matter because that was their little hobby horse. And basically the same politics that are at play in the sort of normal everyday of Sacramento would be at play if you were to convene a convention. So I don't know that we've got an answer to that.
Yeah.
Just add a footnote on the idea of choosing politicians by lottery. So as the political philosopher, I have to say that the idea, of course, has a very distinguished history. It may be completely inappropriate for the present moment, but there are some really good political scientists from long, long ago in ancient Athens who thought this was a super way to run a democracy.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
But the electoral class was a lot smaller.
It's true. That's true.
I want to come back to what is arguably the single most distinctive feature about California's political culture, which is the initiative process. It happens, this is the 100th anniversary of the introduction of the initiative. Hiram Johnson got behind it in 1912, and here we are. It's got a long history. I taught a course, sophomore college actually, the Bill Lane Center for the American West sponsored about 3 or 4 years ago. And we gave it the title, What's the Matter with California? We were riffing on the title of Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And I taught it with a political scientist and an economist, and we divided up the business of calling people in Sacramento and asking them if they would receive our students, and we brought them up there for a week of hands-on experience or exposure to the government. So I'd get on the phone with these people, and I'd say, my name's David Kennedy, I'm at Stanford, and I'm teaching a course to some Stanford undergraduates we'd like to bring up there. The course is called What's the Matter with California? And any number of people interrupted me at that point before I'd even finished the sentence. They said, the initiative process, that's what's wrong with California. And some added Prop 13 in particular.
Right. No,
but we are profligate, if not downright promiscuous, in the way we've used the initiative process. And I'll tell you, frankly, I went through a long period in my history as a California voter when I automatically voted no on every initiative that didn't come out of the legislature. If it came out of the initiative process, voter generated, I just voted against it. Now, I've moderated my views a little bit because in the last few years, the initiative process has actually yielded some interesting results. Top 2 primary, citizen redistricting, simple majority for the budget, and now Prop 30 and Prop 39 all came out of the initiative, along the initiative route. I voted for all of those, as it happens. So I'd just be interested, you're a practitioner and a lifetime student of this. What's your assessment of the initiative process, what its footprint has been in our political culture in the last several decades, and what are the prospects for using it wisely going forward?
Take it away, Gavin.
I'm more, no, I mean, it's largely been hijacked, including those examples, and I'll say this with respect. I happen to love some special interests, so it's not a pejorative, but by special interest. It's hijacked by moneyed interest. Prop 30 was moneyed interest. Prop 38 was moneyed interest. Didn't work so well for Molly Munger, worked better for Governor Brown and big labor that dominantly stepped up and stepped in. We saw what happened to the rights of a minority in the state with Prop 8. A simple majority can change the Constitution, not just a law, change the Constitution and write discrimination into our state constitution as it relates to marriage equality. So it clearly needs to be reformed. I have not met anyone that disagrees with the fact that it should be reformed. I've also not met 2 people that would agree on how. Yeah. And the perverse joke is, of course, the how is it would require an initiative. So it's a vexing issue. And every, Prop 32, I remember talking to some of my labor friends, and they were worried at Prop 32 that just every 7 years we go through this paycheck protection issue, the Prop 32 issue. And they said, we've got to reform the initiative process. Enough. But again, nothing is necessarily offered. Now, I know good groups are working, Bruce, yet again on this. California Forward has some ideas. Nicholas Bergruen, his institute, has some ideas. I imagine you've seen over the years other ideas. What's the sense of, A, do you think I'm right that most people agree it needs to be reformed? And 2, if they do you think there's an approximation of a solution that we can see in the near future?
Yeah, I do think you're right, but I'm a little more skeptical about the second part because I've been to 20 years of reform conferences on the initiative, and it was a big topic when I worked on the academic group on the Constitutional Revision Commission back in the 90s, and that was our issue number 1, was reform the initiative process, it's easier said than done.
We also argued to get rid of the lieutenant governor's office, I recall. I'm just saying, I do recall that.
Yes, I understand. We didn't have the foresight to know that you would be there.
Well done.
By the way,
This
that
is
was
recorded, right?
Gavin, that was the number one question from the students tonight.
I know,
What
the
is the
heck does a
lieutenant governor?
governor do?
We're going to get to that.
Let's hope we run out of time.
No, actually, we got quite a bit. Actually, the person who did that was Roger Knoll, Professor Roger Knoll. So look, the bottom line is this, that right from the start, there were actually two separate conceptions of the initiative process. There was a populist conception of it and a progressive. And even built within direct democracy, there's a progressive element of it and there's a populist element. And what do I mean by that? Well, the progressive notion of the initiative process is that it would supplement the representative democracy, that it could serve as a check. And so you can think of the recall or the referendum as fitting very nicely in that. The populist notion of what direct democracy was about was to supplant representative democracy, that you could get rid of the intermediaries, i.e. representative government that was being corrupted by, at the time, railroads and liquor interests and other interests, and that the people could decide directly. And so this was an attempt to get control. But there's ultimately this paradox, which is that the reason that you created representative government in the first place is that you don't know enough as a citizen to make the very complex decisions that have to be made. And so, to use the language of social science, there's the basic asymmetry of information. And you have a principal agent problem. And so what we've tried to do, in essence, is to solve that principal agent problem with representative government by creating an initiative process, which looks on the face of it as if we're gathering control. But we didn't solve that underlying information problem, which is you still don't know enough to make these decisions, damn it. And so what do? You end up delegating to unelected people, the people that draft these things, the people that endorse these things, the moneyed interests that go out and guarantee that they can get anything on the ballot. David Kennedy for president, you can do it. You know, with enough money, they'll put it on the ballot for you.
Not enough money in all this country.
Well, that's for you to take it. Yes, I
A
understand.
name like Kennedy,
Just in
I
this
don't know.
room, David,
Exactly,
in this
exactly.
room, there's enough money.
We could take a vote later, but so the point is that, in my view, we want to get back to the more progressive notion that the ideal of a hybrid democracy is to figure out, and the challenge is to figure out how to use the new technology of information dissemination, how to use polling and all that to better bring in public opinion, but to do it in a way that is complementary. And so for many of us, the indirect democracy, which we sort of went zipping right through, was probably the institution that we should have been working on and perfecting, because it gives the legislature a chance to respond, because there is a problem. That is, legislature has vested interest, and particularly on political reform issues that affect their well-being, they may not see things in the proper perspective. So to be able to say, well, look, you can either have what's being proposed out there or you can come up with your own version of it, at least forces a kind of dynamic between the two sectors. And that's where I think most of the people, as we were thinking about it, thought that that's where we should go. But voters like the illusion that they can control things, that they can stop things, even though they don't have the information, and even though they're relying on parties and on informal people to really give them the cues to enable them to vote.
There'll be some, I think, very sincere and substantive efforts in the next year or so to try to crack this nut. And there are some examples, other countries as well. Switzerland, people talk about the cool hand of process of Switzerland, allows their version of the legislature to actually make some adjustments as the citizens are putting their petitions out. There are some interesting ideas. So I'm not optimistic, but nor am I completely pessimistic.
Can we use this now to ask what is the cheeky or impertinent question here? It came from several students. I'm going to read it because I thought it was expressed rather lovingly. Please excuse my ignorance, Lieutenant Governor Newsom, but what exactly does a lieutenant governor do? And then it goes on from there. My impression is that mayors are very powerful while lieutenant governors are powerless.
Yes.
If that's true, why are you doing what you're doing?
I don't know.
The version of the question that's here in my printout is even more direct, is what the hell is a lieutenant
It
governor?
does say what the hell. Yes, clearly not at a Jesuit university.
I went to a Jesuit high school.
You did all right. Good. Tongue in cheek, I said this when someone suggested that I run, and I kind of had fun with it. It's on YouTube if you want to see. My initial response was, "Who the hell knows?"
As will this response.
Which is where it comes from. So I get it. Look, the first problem with it is you're independently elected from the governor. I think that needs to be reformed, and I've offered that up. The best practices across the country, every state has a different frame. They have different, for example, Texas, the lieutenant governor is arguably more powerful than the governor. That's not an exaggeration. Other states, they run as partnerships. I know few exactly, considering who the governor is. A former lieutenant governor, interestingly. But other states from Maryland, New York, just as examples, they run as a ticket. And they seem to be, if you looked at a best practice, that's the model. You see historically, I think with rare exception, I really don't know an exception, where a lieutenant governor and the governor, they rarely get along. It's just inherent in the job description. If you're a governor, you're like, just get out of the way. And because there's a sense of a bully pulpit there. The average person will say, well, you're lieutenant governors. Hey, great. So people may listen to you more than you deserve to be listened to. And oftentimes it gets away in the governor's agenda. I do serve on the UC Board of Regents, the CSU Board of Trustees. I chair the State Lands Commission every other year, Ocean Protection Council, and chair the Economic Development Commission in the state. Those are the formal roles of lieutenant governor, and all, I think, are reasonably significant. But I didn't take it for power. I did take it in the context that I could use the bully pulpit to advance some things I care deeply about. The challenge is the governor does have a remarkable amount of authority to dictate the terms of the lieutenant governor. Just briefly, I'll give you one substantive example. Before I became lieutenant governor, there were 4 offices and 26 staff members. When I took over as lieutenant governor, there was 1 office and 3 staff members. Therein lies what the governor can ultimately do to lieutenant governor. Governor Schwarzenegger and the previous lieutenant governor, John Garamendi, did not get along. They shut down 72% or so of the budget was cut, and it was never added back. So they shut down their offices in LA and Fresno, San Francisco, et cetera. So I'm a startup of sorts, and as a consequence, I actually literally moved because we didn't have the money to pay for my office at the State Building, which is vacant. We have to pay rent. So I didn't have the money to pay for it, so it's available to someone else. I literally moved into a startup, bunch of former Stanford grads, you'll be pleased to know, in San Francisco, the Founders Den, and I pay $500 a month for a desk, literally a desk, with 40 startups. And it's been wonderful. So I look at myself as a startup, I work with startups, and I'm trying to be creative in this role.
You would think Jerry talked you into this job. The least he could have done was giving you some money. But,
Yeah, no, it's
relationship
hasn't gone as well as I had hoped.
Hey, so I'm going to try to bail you out here, Gavin, before we really ask some obvious follow-up questions. But I have a question. We talked about this at dinner. Education in California, how did it get this way? Bruce, you have the historical perspective on this, but you do too, David. How did we get this way, and what are you going to do about it?
First of all, with K through 12, you have a real challenge teaching in California that you don't have in Iowa, right? Because you've got lots of people coming from a lot of different backgrounds. And you can see parts of the California K through 12 system that are flourishing, that are doing quite well, but they're homogeneously upper middle class communities. They're basically raising money through their foundations to supplement their athletics, their music, their science programs, et cetera. So ironically, the Serrano versus Priest decisions that said that we should equalize spending ended up creating this sort of black market of private spending so that we have inequality, a greater level of inequality. And of course, when you get to inner city schools, you look that they seem to be doing very well in terms of the state allocation, but a lot of that money goes to security or goes to things that don't really contribute to their educational value. So, I mean, that's just a really tough nut. Again, probably we need to try to give more control down to a lower level and involve parents more, but there are going to be inequities. Anytime you decentralize, you're going to have much more responsible parents in some neighborhoods than others and more with resources. So it's really just a tough nut to crack because of the diversity. And in terms of higher education, if Prop 30 had not passed, I can assure you, having just emerged from the University of California system, it would have been devastating, not to the Berkeleys and the UCLAs, but it would have been absolutely devastating to the rest of the system. It would have, you now have a whole bunch of really good schools that are in the top 25, all the way down to Davis and Irvine. You would have basically lost those schools. They would have no longer been there. You would have basically had two elite schools. Already at Berkeley and UCLA, we're taking 25% of the students from out of state. We will probably have to take more if we have to do that. And fees have gone up so that basically you're getting a lot more money from people out of state than in state. It's a very tough situation. I think in the long run, the UC system will have the resources because it will act more like private universities, but the transition will be very rough.
Yeah, well, and tomorrow we'll be talking about out-of-state students. I serve on that again, CSU and UC boards, and today we had our first of 3-day UC Regents meeting. Look, a couple thoughts. One of the reasons, by the way, I went to South Korea is I was sick and tired of hearing about South Korea and their educational system, top performing education system on the planet outside of Shanghai proper. Wanted to learn a little bit about it. Also wanted to go out there on behalf of the economic development work we're doing. We just passed a free trade agreement. The #1 trading partner for South Korea and the United States is California, but we don't have one foreign office, no trade and commerce agency. We shut them down in 2003. We're not leaning into the world we're living in. Our exports have now dropped significantly in contrast to other states that are outperforming us. We have a whole economic paradigm that we need to fix, and we got to get serious about it. The issue of education, I think, accordingly, we got to get serious. I'm not interested in reform debate because reform, as I was saying to these guys earlier, assumes we're going to use the same ingredients. I am convinced of this, that the system of education across this country no longer is relevant to the world, again, we're living in. Every major country in the world, industrial country, is going through radical reorientation in terms of their education efforts. We still have rows of desks. We have a fast food model of education, mass education. We still have bells that look exactly in school classrooms that look exactly like they looked 150 plus years ago. We still have the same age cohorts being educated at the same time. Literally, someone described it as people that are educated based on their date of manufacture. It is a system that is standardized where we're literally, I know it's the cliche, it's the applause line for politicians, but we're teaching to the test. In a world where it's about creative thinking, it's about collaboration, it's about the 3 C's, not just the 3 R's. And so we've got to get serious about it. And what's happening is a lot of wonderful things are occurring around us. We just haven't done them at scale. Folks like Sal Khan that we're all talking about, flipping the classroom, doing homework in the classroom, getting the lectures based on where you are, and the individualized lectures at home, having coaches and mentors of sorts as teachers, as opposed to broadcast model of teaching lecturers. Those things are happening here at Stanford. You lost one of the great educators in the world, Sebastian Thrun, the world's leading expert on artificial intelligence, because he got frustrated with only teaching 200 folks a year, decided to put his course online. 20,000+ people took it. He then retested everyone. The top 200, or rather 170 of the 200 people that he tested took it online, not in the classroom. When he asked folks that still were in the classroom whether or not they'd take it next year, the vast majority said no, and they said, why? He said, well, because we can fast forward you, we can rewind you, Sebastian, and then he quit, and he started Udacity University. We're now working with him at the CSU system, and he'll be doing a partnership with San Jose State to begin to radically look differently at some of their online educational offerings. I think the blended learning, the individualized learning, the work that's done at Rocket Ship, the things that are happening in this area are exciting and enlivening. What I find completely dull is the debate around seniority and tenure. Because if you think somehow that's going to solve your education problem, I'll just offer you this as a question, and if you can answer it, I'm trying to get an answer. Why the heck hasn't that solved it in all those other states that don't have it? They're still not performing at world-class standards. We're now number 15th in the world in associate degrees. We're 30th or 31st in math, 23rd in science, out of 70 countries. This is serious. And so I'm not interested in failing more efficiently. I'm not interested in dumping more money into a system that needs it. It was starving, thank God for Prop 30. But you put another $10 billion, I'm not sure you're going to get radically different outcomes. We've got to completely reimagine K through 12. And yes, higher ed. Because I think you're on a trajectory, despite the 6 out of the top 25 universities on the Shanghai Index that exist in the state, from Caltech, Stanford, and the 3 UCs on the top of that list, that is no longer as well relevant necessarily the world we're living in. And so we're hoping to have some radically different conversations at CSU and UC beyond the stale, increase your tuition and beg for money in the state. We've doubled tuition since '07, tripled it since 2001. Today we staved off the inevitability, higher fees at CSU, just because politically it would have seemed inappropriate to do it a week after Prop 30 passed. There was no new money under Prop 30 for CSU, not a dollar, it just meant there was not less money. And there was about $100 million for UC, but that money is pretty trivial in a $20+ billion budget. And so I'm very fearful in a few months we're going to have another round of debates around tuition increases, and we just can't absorb them. We can't afford them.
We're very close to the end of our time, and I want to ask the indulgence of the audience for just one final question with just a minute or two as a way of trying to bring together to a conclusion a lot of the conversation we've had over the course of the past 8 weeks. So if you're anything like me, as you paid attention over the course of the past 8 weeks, you've learned a lot about the dysfunction of the system of politics, from campaign finance to the role of special interests to the way that the short time horizons of people who are in office systematically disadvantage the idea of long-term reform where the voice of the people is being heard. And we heard more of that again tonight. We also hear, especially from Jim, that the young people in the room are the ones who need to go out and change the world, and that the hope that any of us have is going to rest on your shoulders. Bruce, you told the story about the student you had teaching who went into politics but then found herself beholden to a special interest group yet again. At least in my own experience teaching Stanford undergraduates, the happy circumstance is that there really is, in my experience, a social civic motivation, a desire to tackle some of these large problems, but with no confidence about how to channel their energy and talent. So keeping in mind what we've learned over the course of the past 8 weeks about the political dysfunction and the ambition, talent, and energy that's in the room here, can either of you offer some benediction, as it were, or advice more generally about how you would want to channel the energy in the room in front of you?
Well, I'll start. Okay, I'm going to be controversial. And that is that I've noticed a pattern with Stanford, which is personified by Meg Whitman and some of the other, maybe even Mitt Romney to some degree, which is the tendency for people. I think the good thing about Stanford is that it's very private sector oriented and yet imbues this sense of civic mindedness. But I think the lesson of some of the Stanford people that have gone out, like Steve Wesley and Meg Whitman, et cetera, is that they didn't pay their dues to figure out how the system really works. And I think some of the great disappointment that your generation has over Obama was not understanding the way Congress works and the way the filibuster works, et cetera. So if you're going to change the system, you can't have a superficial understanding of the system. And you need to start that civic education the day you graduate, and you need to join organizations, get involved in things, and really sort of understand it. Not hopefully to get co-opted the way Gavin was talking about, but to understand and to think, use the analytics that you're given at Stanford to think about the problem as you're in it, and sort of think about, well, okay, what's wrong with these incentives and how can it change? So I think waiting 20 years after you've made your fortune to then sort of parachute into politics is too late, because it's an incredibly complex matter, as I think Gavin and I have given you some sense of, and you really need to try to understand this from the bottom up.
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. I mean, I'm reminded of that wonderful speech that Bobby Kennedy gave, said what the world needs are the qualities of youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a quality of imagination. And so it's that quality of imagination, it's that state of mind, regardless of your time of life, young or old, that's so essential today. That sense of idealism, that willingness to step up and step in, that desire for real audacity, willingness to take risks, to get those arrows in the back, to maintain your courage and your convictions, at the same time not to be ideological, always be open to argument, interested in evidence, and be other people oriented. I think, you know, from a political frame, I do think the process de-geniuses you. Back to my notion of originality to dying as and terming out as copies. But I'm not necessarily giving up on it. Maybe it's because post-election I always have this new sense of hope and optimism, both federally and even within the state. California's back. I really mean that. We got a lot of work to do, but we've had a very difficult decade around solvency. I think what is going to be refreshing to many of us is we're now about to have a debate once again about greatness. We were the tentpole of the American economy in 1950 to 1980, grew at 3.7% a year in annual job growth. The last 3 decades, we flatlined at 1.1%. We have the opportunity to read our own history and be reminded of those engines of growth, that focus on education and real dramatic reform, focus on infrastructure, robust federal partnerships of research and development, open immigration policy, so if we weren't conveying talent out of Stanford or UC system, we were always getting first-round draft choices around the rest of the world, the best and the brightest. I think people get that, and I think the dialogue I'm hearing, even from the other side of the aisle, they understand there's a formula for success in this state, in this country. And so I'm going to maintain my optimism as long as we maintain that quality of imagination. And final point, just in the spirit of optimism. You know, this is a state with more scientists, more engineers, more researchers, more Nobel laureates than any other state in the nation. We talked about still 6 of the top 25 universities on the planet still here in California, birthplace of life science and biotech, nanotechnology. We're leading the way in synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, robotics, genomics, additive manufacturing, 3D manufacturing, what's happening in the digital world, social, local, mobile, cloud. That's all here in California. And so the final point I want to make is, in many ways, the solutions to our problem are in your pocket. They're in your hands. These tools of technology are the great leveler. The ability to look at the world as Steve Jobs did, not as a vending machine, the government model, right, where you put in taxes, you get police, fire, education, healthcare, and if you don't like what you get, you shake the machine. So the Occupy, we go the Move On, or Tea Party. But this idea of jobs, which was simply this notion of a platform. Eric Liu has a great book called The Gardens of Democracy, where he talks about being big on what and small on how. I think there's this whole new consciousness about solving big problems, but being less prescriptive on how we solve them. This whole maker movement that Chris Anderson is talking about. This whole do-it-yourself, this framework, again, jobs, government as a platform. There's an app for that. These tools of technology, these digital, Peter Samuelson, we were talking about digital natives. All these young folks, these digital natives. This is radical departure from the world I grew up in. And it's the world now we're living in and we're embracing. And so I'm optimistic about this state, the most diverse state in the world's most diverse democracy. And I think the world looks to us to see it. It's possible to live together and advance together across our differences. There's a lot to be proud of and celebrate. And so I leave you with, hopefully, a little bit of optimism as we turn the page in California to a new and wonderful future.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And thank our guests.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.